Um, Welcome everybody to our Zoom presentation. Um, Hopefully your intention was to join us for the 2021 VCOF lecture series. If you were intending to take a Russian class tonight or some sort of other tutorial, you're in the wrong place. And as we have about half of our participants still logging on, I'm going to go ahead and let Dory provide some background on the lecture series.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay, well, as Pastor Edie said, in a moment, she is going to introduce our guest speaker, Reverend Alex Patchen McNeill. But I just first wanted to say a few words about the McCoff lecture series. So Reverend McNeill is the latest of 20 distinguished guest speakers invited to Newport Presbyterian Church. And these annual lectures are possible because of a fund set up to honor the memory of Doreen B. McCoff, wife of Newport's founding pastor, David McCoff. Doreen, some of you remember and some of you don't, but she was a member of Newport throughout the 1960s and returned in 1991. And as a pastor's wife, she didn't play the piano or sing and avoided giving devotions at the women's meetings and seldom expressed her opinions about churchly matters, but she loved the people of Newport, both the children and the adults. So her final struggle with cancer became an occasion for a deepened experience of worship. So the lectures in this series have focused on the topics that are close to Doreen's heart: worship, education in the faith, and social witness and action. And David McCoff is here with us today. And on behalf of Newport, I'd like to thank him from the bottom of my heart for the excellent lectures we've enjoyed over the last 20 years and today. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Dory. I have a blessing to just kind of frame our time tonight. It's actually just an excerpt from Amanda Gorman's inaugural poetic prayer that she offered up last Wednesday, just a little segment of it. She wrote, "To compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions. And we lift up our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew. That even as we hurt, we hoped. That even as we tired, we tried. That will forever be tied together, victorious. Not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division." Friends, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague in ministry, the Reverend Alex McNeill, Executive Director of More Light Presbyterians. Alex comes to us via Zoom from his home in Asheville, North Carolina. What you may know is that Alex holds a Master's of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School and a bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. What you may not know is that Alex and I met in a coaching training a few years ago, and I was so excited when I saw Alex's name on the top of a short list for possible future McCoff lecture guest presenters last January. So Alex, you said yes to our invitation. You've said yes to us many times, and we are grateful for you being on this sacred journey to build bigger tables, bigger hearts, indeed a bigger welcome in 2021. Alex, welcome. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's wonderful to be with you. And as Pastor Edie said, we did start talking about this a year ago. And boy, we had no idea what was in store for us in the year between saying yes and being here. But I'm so grateful for technology and you all showing up and registering and wanting to be present tonight and tomorrow and the rest of the weekend so that we can spend some good quality time together. I really appreciate the invitation and to bring a conversation around ministry beyond the binary. So I'll be speaking to you for the next hour or so, and then we'll have some facilitated question and answer. Although don't fall asleep yet, because there is a couple of moments during what I'm about to share with you where I'll invite some participation in the chat, but I'll tell you when that's time. So just know we get to talk a little bit more deeply together. So I really appreciate you leading off with Amanda Gorman's just gorgeous poem from this past week. I've been sitting with it a lot lately. It really was a balm to my spirit, but specifically naming around this idea around healing what divides us as part of what we're hoping for in this next era of our government. And I think that that's exactly what this lecture series is about, is around taking a deep dive at the way our divisions have been created in the form of binaries and binary thinking. So we're going to dig some deeply into what that looks like. And tonight's lecture is about getting on the same page about what do we mean by binaries? How does that show up in a couple of different ways? And then how does that impact our ministry? We're going to look at the common root of binary thinking. Really, where did it come from? How is it constructed? And explore how and why binaries can be so harmful. Then tomorrow, we're going to take what we've deconstructed. So we're going to end tonight with the pieces of the puzzle on the floor. And we're going to tomorrow tunnel our way through to a new possibility of ministry beyond the limitations of binary thinking. We know that to heal divisions, we must address what first has divided us. So tonight, we're going to look at the either or thinking that permeates our world. I don't think we could have a more relevant time for this topic. It's been on clear display recently, but I felt it was relevant, even 6 months ago, a year ago, and I want to tell you why. A lot of the times in the work that I do with More Light Presbyterians, I'm invited to church basements and sanctuaries and committee meetings where folks are really grappling with what kinds of actions for justice are we going to take? Where are we called in the world? And often I'll get into a conversation where someone or many people within the room will say, well, we worked on this issue last year, we can't do it this year. Or if we take on issues of LGBT inclusion, we can't work for racial justice. Like the two, it might be too disruptive in our congregation. I know that's not quite Newport's problem, but I do end up in those kinds of conversations a lot. And it has helped me to see some of the ways that thinking about things as either or can really limit our understanding of what God is calling us to do in the world. At the same time, ministry beyond the binary is deeply personal. I'm often invited into those spaces as a transgender person, a publicly transgender person, to come and train on transgender issues in the realms of gender and sexuality. And another binary that I see a lot is thinking that, either you're transgender or you're not, that trans people are so far removed from some folks' understanding of gender that they can't comprehend it, that they can't see the ways in which their own gender has been part of a journey that they've been on. And it feels like more of a division to overcome rather than a shared history that we can explore together. And so we're going to start our conversation tonight by starting to dig into a specific binary as like our case study of seeing the ways that binaries deeply impact and binary thinking deeply impacts our world. But before we do that, I'm going to give you a sneak peek for tomorrow. And this is actually a slide that I use in all my trainings around gender and sexuality. And we call it our covenants for inclusion. And it's a way to ground our time together, to help us figure out how we can show up for brave space in conversations that can feel tricky, that can feel like we're finally like taking the lid off of some silence that is permeated within a community. And I actually believe that this slide is the most important thing we'll talk about all weekend. That is actually, to me, one of the models for what it means to do ministry, to be in the world beyond a binary. And it'll be handy because it'll help set up our expectations for our time together in conversation over the next few days. What I love about covenants for inclusion, sometimes we've gone to those meetings where we say, okay, what practices do we want to make sure that we do to hold ourselves accountable? And it can become this kind of checklist of things you have to do or have to not do, like raise your hand before you do a bathroom break, or we're going to pass the talking stick, or everyone's going to only speak for 2 minutes, which can be very helpful for getting people to actually respect one another. But I think this covenant for inclusion might be a way that we could think about a posture of being together, an embodied way of being in conversation. And I think this is a very helpful framework as we'll dig into the work we're about to do later. So what are those covenants for inclusion? You see 3 continua on the slide right now. And I want to look at the first one as thinking about, we have this continuum of people on one end and definitions on the other, especially in the work on LGBTQ inclusion. People get really hung up on what words mean about someone's identity. If I don't know the exact definition of what it means to be transgender, then I'm not sure I can go talk to the person next to me if I know they are transgender. What we really try and strive for is that actually there's a way to ground ourselves in relationship that means that I'm actually more curious about what I don't know about you, what I've yet to learn, from a place of hospitality and wanting to get to know the person. That definitions are not as important as the person in front of you, because we in ministry beyond a binary, our definitions means like what it means to be transgender is different than what it means to Laverne Cox, for example. I'm pretty sure the way we show up in the world is very different, and I'd be curious what it means to her. And so, not presuming that we know the answer about what someone else is thinking, believing, or doing is one way that we can show up with a posture of inclusion. The next is a continuum of what I like to call hospitality, being hospitable with someone and on one end, and being lurid on the other. Or my shorthand is, let me Google that for you. You know how sometimes people will ask you questions, sometimes kids, sometimes adults, where it's like, the answer is achievable if only they had a little curiosity on the internet about what something means or how something proceeds in the world. But oftentimes in the work of identity, and especially for those with marginalized identities, someone will come to us, not of those identities, asking questions that move into the kind of lurid category, where it's like you only want to know this to satisfy your own curiosity, not to build relationship, rather than asking questions in a way that's about mutuality, getting to know one another. It feels like a one-sided conversation where you're trying to interview me on 20/20 or 60 minutes and like get all the information you can out of me and then send me on my way. And I think that we fall along these continua of hospitality and idle curiosity a lot. And so what we're inviting in a covenant for inclusion is a noticing of, why am I asking this question? Why do I need to know this? And really trying to figure out, is it about getting to know someone better or helping to enrich yourself in relationship with that person? Or is it truly about, for transgender people, a question that comes through a lot is like, what surgeries have you had? And I'm just not really talking about most people's medical history in a daily basis. So unless we've specifically said, I'm happy to talk about that, I think that there's a way people can ask it. They just want to know rather than get to know who I am. The next continua is one it's less about you and another person and more about an internal sense of where you are on the spectrum. And I've labeled it kind of imperfectly, the spectrum of vulnerability and kind of taking care of yourself. In these spaces, in these conversations, when you're in relationship with someone, particularly across difference, it's a vulnerable thing to show up and start to get to know somebody. It's a vulnerable thing to start a conversation around a topic or an issue that you want to know more about, but you're still wading in the water. Sometimes, and so what I encourage in these conversations around across difference is that we're really striving to show up with some vulnerability, to acknowledge our growing edges, to acknowledge what might be difficult for us. We've all had those kinds of conversations where they're clearly angry, but it's coming out in a different, kind of like in a different way that is not very direct. And the other side of that continuum to me is about a little bit of self-protection, a little bit of taking care of yourself to recognize, hey, maybe I'm not in the space to have this kind of a deep conversation right now. Have you ever had your spouse or partner or someone come to you and start getting in a conversation and you're like, I am exhausted. I'd love to talk about this with you, but I need to go to sleep now so we can talk about it in the morning. Me, anyone? That was just me earlier this week, when I literally had to say to my spouse, I'm like, I would love to be in this conversation. I cannot go to the depth that you would like me to right now because it is 10 p.m. and my body has shut down, which she really appreciated, because at the end of the day, she's like, I'd rather not continue trying to have this conversation about something that wasn't direly urgent until we were both in a better place to actually talk about it. So to me, that's about taking care of yourself. And when we don't notice that we need that, I think that's when we can become a little bit of hostile or shut down or checked out. And so this is an opportunity for us to notice where we are, what all has been going on in our day, and are we ready to be a little bit vulnerable, to share more of ourselves in relationship with somebody. Because what it means to expand our understanding of inclusion, which to me is part of a ministry beyond a binary of who's in and who's out, is really about building relationship, getting to know people. And the way you get to know anybody is that you both have to share of yourselves. It can't just be a one-sided conversation. So I want to like raise of hands if that feels, if you're understanding what I'm saying and that seems like, okay, I can flow with that. I understand that. I'm getting it. Anyone? Okay, great. We can talk a little bit more about it in the Q&A, but I appreciate you going down that journey with me, because the reason I think it's so important is when we're working across difference, when we're working across either or thinking, moving into the space of it's not so yes or no. There's actually a continuum of where I am in any given moment. And by the way, I'm multiple places in any given moment. Then I think that helps us to start to nuance what it means to be able to do this work. So I want to take concepts of gender and sexual orientation as some of our case studies around binaries. And I want to start by having us think about ourselves. Remember when I talked about vulnerability? I want us to think about how we've been formed, because most of us growing up probably have had experiences of people telling you things about what it means to be male or female, what it means to be straight or gay or in between. And I want us to think about that, because what I found in church basements and all across the country is we don't get space to think about that. And that's actually something that as a transgender person and as a staff of other transgender people and working with LGBTQ folks in the church, I think that's actually been a gift that we've brought to the church at different points, is invitations to each of us to think about how we've been formed, how we've been shaped, what does it mean to be ourselves? How do we find out who we are? That we're trying, each of us here on this call, all 47 of us, are trying to figure out how do we show up most authentically in this world. And sometimes that, and many times that means navigating expectations from our families, our cultures, our religions, and our regions about what it means to be male or female, or even pushing against those norms with our feelings, behaviors, or identities. Okay, so we're gonna do a little thought experiment. And this is gonna be the part where I invite you to chat me. So if you open up the chat box and you're gonna click on, there's a drop-down menu, and somewhere in there, it should say Alex McNeill. That's me. And so if you go ahead and click on that, then whenever you type your answer in, it'll come directly to me. And this might be overwhelming, but we're gonna figure it out. So I wanna think about 3 different points of time in our life. So I'm gonna give you 1 second to get the chat box ready. Don't chat me yet. Okay. I want you to think back to some of your earliest childhood memories. And can you remember some of the things that you liked to do as a child? What were some of the things that you liked to play with? What were some of the games you liked to play? And what are the things you like to wear? Now, don't tell me those answers yet. As you're thinking about those, like, who were your friends? Who were you as a kid? And to think about, and good, some people are trying to answer, just you're doing it right. But the question I want you to answer for me is, were there times you were told or given encouragement to do something because you were a girl, or told you couldn't do something because you were a girl? Were there times you were told, like, as in the opposite way, as boys don't do that or girls don't do that? Thinking about those kinds of things, were there times like that? So I want you to answer to me either some of the things you like to do, what were some of those things, who were you? And then were there times when you were told no, or given a lot of encouragement, like, oh, you look great in that dress, for example. So I'm just curious if there's memories that come up. And we're doing a little experiment together. Normally we'd be in the same room and we get to just talk it out. So if you would honor me by chatting something to me, that would be awesome. I'm gonna give you 1 minute to do it. So whatever comes to your mind, just tell me. And I'm the only one who'll see it, so don't worry. Great. Seeing some answers of folks liking to read or ride bikes or play dodgeball, pretending to be a zoo animal and realizing you might never be a zoo animal. I myself wanted to be a zookeeper, so I deeply resonate with that. Dressing up and looking nice. Someone was wanting to go to the YMCA, where their brother had so much fun, but couldn't go. Men only cry when you're physically hurt. Peers setting boundaries. Brothers able to play sports, but you weren't, and you've always regretted. Wearing hand-me-down dresses from older sisters. I think that's really powerful around someone else's. Maybe they got to choose it and you didn't. As a child, boys played with boys, but boys were discouraged from playing with girls. Oh, keep your knees together. So there's expectations around posture. Like to climb trees, was told you were a tomboy. Some folks had parents who encouraged you to do whatever you wanted. That's great. Yep. Like to play with dolls, told that you needed to wear lipstick. You were encouraged to have to perform a particular gender expectation. Yes. Hide and seek, sports, brothers got to do all the cool stuff. Not appropriate for girls to wear shorts in public. Okay. Y'all are rocking my world. Thank you for thinking about that with me, because I think it sounds clear that there's a range of experiences in this room, all 49 windows of us, there's more than 49 people here, but sometimes it was a message of encouragement. Sometimes it was discouragement. Sometimes it was a peer rule or a parent rule. So we're just going to hold that. And I want to think about this as a teenager. What were some of the things that you like to do or wear, or how did you show up in the world to kind of express your most authentic self? And was that encouraged? Were there people who pushed back on that, for example? Great. So take a minute to think about that and go ahead and chat me again. My biggest fight in childhood with my mom was I wanted to wear an outfit from our dress up box, like the play pretend box, and she would not let me wear it. That was me trying to define what I could wear and what I couldn't. All right, we got, okay, school dances, girls weren't allowed to ask boys to dance. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder how that might have shifted in some later years. A trumpet was a boy's instrument. Music was an area where boys and girls could work together and value each other's talent and contributions. That's amazing, except for maybe not in the trumpet in one person's world. It was only girl in a high school calculus class. So even, okay, in academics, we got some folks into motocross and riding dirt bikes. All right. Loved music and was outgoing. Girls don't ask boys on a date, the dance rule. So the messages from our childhood to our adolescence, some themes stay the same, but the nature of those messages start to change. Learning to play the clarinet would make your mouth fish-like. So that's an expectation of, that's like a lot bundled in there around playing an instrument and then how that might change your face. Some people kind of got to experiment with different kinds of clothing, dresses and jeans, but had a limitation around what sports you could play. Yeah, a lot of folks resonating with not being able to call or ask out the person that you were interested in. And then a person who went to a girls' school that didn't have some of the science and math classes. So you had to go to the boys' school for that. I think that's a really interesting noticing around something like academics that some might say is neutral, but yet there's these limitations placed on who can and cannot do certain things. Thank you again for thinking about that with me around a teenager self. And I wanna think about now, who we are now. Are there still some, like, who are you now? What are the kinds of things you like to do? Who are the people that you like to be with? I mean, clearly everybody here. And are there still messages that you receive around encouragement or discouragement around lines of gender or sexuality, around things about that? And then if that is kind of a tough question, maybe there's thinking about how have you changed since your teenager self around how you show up in the world? And maybe noticing, has there been an evolution in who you are and how you present that? Okay, so we got some answers coming through already. Thanks, y'all. A change in the way you dress from not really wearing dresses anymore, and an experience of women getting shamed if they can't cook. I think that's a powerful one around that, you know, even in folks who are dating now, still try and have the conversation of who can cook and who can't, and the expectation that one person might be the person to do that. There's expectations regarding like shaving and around, you know, what bodily hair are you allowed to show and not? Yeah, there's expectations around if you're crying or emotional, if you're a male, and that's still not okay. Working in a kind of upper management role, and there's expectations around how women show up versus men, and some unwritten rules for women that are much narrower than men. Absolutely. There's some conversations around kind of activities as like riding bikes, singing, golf, group activities. That's awesome. Folks who want to wear heels and makeup, that's great. Yeah, just it's kind of strange a little bit. Just think about yourself in this present moment. Maybe to really like, it's kind of like zooming out from where you are right now. Yeah, someone was told that Kamala Harris being the vice president wasn't a big deal, and didn't understand to that person that it was a big deal, and didn't believe her, that they didn't believe that a woman really couldn't have been president before. Absolutely. I think in the past week, we've had a lot of conversations nationally and personally around, you know, how powerful it was to see Kamala Harris sworn in as vice president, and how many folks of color, how many women did not believe that was ever going to happen. All right, keep answering. My dog is barking. Let me go grab her real quick and I'll be right back. Okay, y'all showed up. Great. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of coming through around what women are restricted in doing. And I think that that's, I want to notice that, because I think as women, a lot of women have to navigate those rules made for men and then figure out what specific rules apply to them as women. And then so I think you start to see the fabric of what it has been to many, something that has been invisible, particularly to folks who identify as men, because that is, I think, the core of what binaries do, is that binaries imply a power relationship, a power differential, and they're not side by side. There's a hierarchy there, whether or not that's what we believe about men and women, but that's a cultural kind of norm in operation. And that for the person on the top of the binary, whether, and with the most power, everything else is invisible. And we have to do work to really see the kind of, the film, The Matrix, I think has spoken a lot to this, of like, you kind of have to like open your eyes to see like, oh, it is really surrounding me. And so it takes some conscious looking to be able to see it, because it's intentionally like under an invisibility cloak, to borrow from Harry Potter. Okay, you all showed up in the chat. Thank you. So we will pause on our call and response portion for now, and I'll have another moment a little bit later. So I think from that, one of the most visible and noticeable binaries in operation in our world is this idea of gender on a binary. Either you're a man or a woman, male or female. And it's certainly one that we have to grapple with a lot at More Light, to start to see the fabric of how that's been constructed. And so I'm using this as our case study to look at the prevalence of binary thinking in gender and sexuality. If you want a deeper dive on all this, we have workshops and teach-ins that I can send you links to that help us explore this more in depth. So this is going to be fast, so we can get to some more good stuff. So my sister just gave birth yesterday, basically, overnight, Wednesday night. It was pretty incredible. It was really awesome. I'm excited. I'm an uncle now, first time ever. And yeah, someone, Jim, you asked if I can define binary, and I will be doing that in just a minute. But binary as a term means one or the other, either or, things that are kind of in opposition to one another. Okay, moment of birth. My sister had a baby. What was the first question do you think people asked when they found out that she'd given birth? Yeah, you're telling me. Is it a boy or a girl? She had a girl, thank you. And what I have noticed with this question, is it or a boy or a girl, is that the baby does not get personhood until they have a gender. That's not intentional on the asker's part, but they just want to know, is it a boy or a girl? And once they know, then they can like click the part in their brain that's like, okay, I understand something about this child. And so we're going to look at what the supposed understandings are when we click in our brain, oh, that's a girl or that's a boy. Okay. And this is going to get a little sticky because we're talking about things that are in operation within our world that we're not supposed to see in a way. So we're trying to peel back the curtain on gender and other norms of behavior that we are starting to do in our own lives, right? So I want to look at this idea of, we just, in the prior slide, I can go one back. See, on the birth certificate, they checked one thing. Whoop, too far. Okay. They checked on my sister's baby's birth certificate that she was a girl. But in actuality, we know that there's a lot more nuance to what it means to be female identified or assigned, like we would call that sex assigned at birth. The sex assigned at birth for my sister's baby was female. And that implies a set of external genitalia, chromosome that they think that's about their chromosome, like that means what their biological makeup is female. They haven't exactly checked her for that, but that's the assumption that they're making based on external evidence, right? And we have other workshops to talk about how nuanced even the sex we were assigned at birth is beyond a binary. So the set of expectations that gets checked around what it means to be assigned female at birth is that as my sister's kiddo grows up, that eventually she's going to identify as a woman. And our culture has a lot of expectations about what it means to be a woman. Some of the folks in the chat were starting to draw those threads out. There's a set of behaviors in the workplace. Maybe you're not showing up too aggressively. Maybe you're really nurturing in your home. Maybe you're the one who cooks. And if you don't, then maybe are you even a woman? Not everyone believes these as strongly, but still it's part of the fabric of how we have to navigate our cultural understandings. And then there's gender expression. So identity is about how you feel inside, and expression is how you show that on the outside. And so the two are very interrelated, but it's important to nuance those, especially when we're talking about folks who are transgender or non-binary, because the two don't need to match up for you to identify a particular way. So gender expression, like kind of in the far end of the spectrum, hyper feminine, there's a lot of expectations around clothing and behavior. And then the expectation that gets clicked in a lot of people's brain is eventually she'll marry a man and have a family. So there's a whole set of expectations around what kind of man. Does he earn more than her? Is he taller than her? What kind of work does he do? What kind of man is he, right? So I'm running through this real quick, but I hope you're starting to see that even these little words have tons of expectations alongside them. And maybe you're starting to see that in your own life. So if, let's say she had a boy instead, the sex assigned at birth would be male. Another thing around external genitalia, belief in what kind of chromosomes that means for the child and how their hormones are going to enact in their body over time. Gender identity, that he would identify as a man, and that comes with a whole set of strength and not crying and all sorts of expectations. And then gender expression as masculine. So you feel like a man and you act masculine. Have you ever been to the shampoo aisle at the grocery store and there's men's shampoos and women's shampoos, and start to notice some of what they say on the labels of men's shampoos versus women's shampoos? It was Glennon Doyle in the book Untamed that really pointed this out to me around how aggressive men's shampoo can be. or like it's about dominating. You're going to dominate your day just by washing your hair, apparently. And so even the product you apply to your head, if you still have some, or hair, if you still have some, is about what kind of man you're going to be in the world and how you're going to express that. And then, of course, the expectation is that that man would eventually marry a woman and start a family. And there's all kinds of expectations about what sort of woman that would be. Okay. So what I want you to notice is when we talk about binaries, which is our current context believes that you're either a woman or a man, and the two are very distinct and different. Now, we're seeing that, but we're also in our own conversation that we just had through chat, realizing, whoa, how we each live those out in our lives and the messages we've received about what it means to live those out, that's pretty complicated. But binaries try and keep it simple. But what we know is it's totally not simple, right? And the reason they want to keep it simple is for maintenance of power. So I want to just name that it's not only us here in this chat that have started to nuance gender and this rigid binary of male or female. This chart is something that the youth at an LGBT youth organization plotted around how they identify, and they tried to put it on an XY axis and started to recognize even the terms and definitions that they were trying to use didn't quite capture their full selves. Definitions and terms are important as part of naming who we are, but I share this slide as like a real-time example that youth in particular are starting to nuance what gender and sexuality mean. And that's a good thing. Anyone feeling uncomfortable? This is a lot. We've just done a lot. Do you feel like you're falling off your horse? Our hope is that we can get back on the horse as we go through the rest of this. But for this moment, I want us to just take a deep breath and let it out. One of my favorite trainers, Jessica Vasquez Torres, in the work of anti-racism, has us take deep breaths to just start to integrate the information we've received. But appreciate you all hanging with us. I want to offer another way that starts to give that sneak peek of life beyond binary thinking, that those check boxes weren't enough to capture who we are. In response to that discomfort that we were just feeling about the limitations of the binary, this is the gender unicorn. And it was developed by the Trans Student Equality Resources Group to more clearly represent how gender identity, gender expression, our sex assigned at birth, and sexual attraction work in our lives. That there's not just one option. Like we did on our covenants for inclusion, we can be in multiple places at once, and most of us are. The trouble is that words are limiting, and yet we need words to describe ourselves and to communicate with each other. So this visual representation, to me, shows the possibilities that that we can embody together. And so again, we could train and do a deeper dive on this, but I'm just showing you this is our case study. In fact, not just the youth at the youth organization where our staff member Jess used to work that just did that graph, but actually the Trevor Project, which is a national suicide hotline for LGBTQ youth, did research on 25,000 youth who are LGBT and found that 1 in 4 identified outside of the gender binary, basically saying the simple term woman or man did not capture who they were. And that 7%, an additional 7% of those youth identified as a transgender man or transgender woman. So a little more nuancing that. So that's like 32% of youth. So that's 1 in 3. And the Williams Institute at University of California, Los Angeles found that among all teens in California, not just LGBT, like all teens, that 27% identified with some level of gender nonconformity. That's pretty huge. We haven't had data like that before, but I think it has confirmed what many of us have seen kind of anecdotally around youth pushing against these rigid limitations of gender, of sexual orientation categories to start to name more authentically who they are. The challenge to us, especially those of us doing ministry, especially those of us doing ministry that respects the youth in our congregations, is that they're saying something to us about these limitations of gender categories and offering the possibilities of authenticity when they can claim who they are. And our question is, will we listen? Will we take to heart this example of gender and the limitations of the binary and think about it more deeply in the way that we understand our calling in the world, not just to live within our gender, but to follow God? So now we're going to get to the fun part where we talk about a definition of the binary. So I want to offer this definition from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And the way they define binary is a division into two groups or classes that are considered diametrically opposite. Now, in computer coding, I'm not an expert, but I'm going to pretend for 1 second, Jacob. There's binary 0 and 1. There's these numerals that inform all of the code we can write. And either you're a 0 or you're a 1. You can't merge the two. They're opposite. They're different. That's a numeric example. But the way we kind of take that numeric example and extrapolate it to categories and classes that are considered diametrically opposite. Think about a magnet, north and south magnets, like, they're opposite. I can't talk about magnets. I don't know what I'm talking about, but I want to hold this idea of diametrically opposite, and the idea that there's just two. Binary implies two, 0, 1. And I think that right there, diametrically, like this idea that there's some sort of like, just like complete opposition. When we talk about opposition, that there's like this idea that they're kind of rubbing against each other. And to me, that also impacts unintentionally our understanding of God. If we're so locked in binary thinking, that impacts how we understand God. And then how do we actually engage in seeing beyond the binary if we're conceiving it as diametrically opposed? And so I just want us to like hold that definition, that it operates not just about gender or sexual orientation categories, but there's all kinds of binaries, and we're going to start to name some together right now. So I want to move to thinking about what are some of the ways, like moving beyond gender, what are some of the binaries that show up in our world? And I invite you again to take to the chat if you have an idea, and type a binary that you see. Okay, great, you're doing it. And I'll read some of them out. Okay, so there's, and sometimes binaries get pitched as versus, right? Male versus female. So there's black and white binaries. There's hot and cold, tall and short, yes or no, in or out, fat or thin. Exactly. Any others you want to offer? Left and right. Yeah, that might be a binary we have to keep, but can you go northeast? I don't know. On or off, old or young, liberal or conservative, right? Up or down, positive or negative. Yep, another liberal or conservative. Rich or poor, intelligent or stupid, happy or sad, good or bad. Great, you guys are getting it. So I want to share some that Black lives versus blue lives. Okay. Yep. So there's several realms of binaries we're talking about. There's theological, there's ideological, there's on, off, I don't know, the state of being, Christian or non-Christian, have or have not. Yeah. Some of the ones that occurred to me are very similar to what y'all said: fat and thin, black and white, Democrat and Republican, liberal, conservative, truth versus myth, science versus religion. Great. And then I think ultimately the mega binary is us versus them. And you'll start to see that depending on the way we write the binaries or line them up, that you start to see there's an implied, this one is better than that one. Maybe it's, we believe one is better because that is what we believe around, like whether we're Democrat or Republican, or liberal or conservative. But in us versus them, that's a very clear one of being an us is better than being them. Whatever we're talking about, whether for me it's University of North Carolina basketball versus Duke basketball, or other sports teams that we might be allegiant to, that our team is clearly the best one and the other team just is the worst. And another binary of straight versus gay. Absolutely. I think sexuality, we haven't really delved a lot into that in this section, but yes. So you all got it. Oh, American versus foreign. Perfect. So we have a lot of binaries in operation. We could spend the rest of our time tonight talking about different ones that we see, but I want to actually look at how our binaries get linked, that they're not just in a comma, if we were to name them all out on the prior slide, that binaries actually start to link together to, we've talked about it in terms like around power, around amassing privilege, or disadvantage, that they start to get stacked on one another, depending on which side of the binary that you're on. And what I want to argue or name is that binaries, the most extreme binaries, ideological, political, theological, have been structurally maintained, aka they were created for a purpose, and they share a common root. And so I want us to spend a little, mostly the rest of our time tonight, exposing the common root of binary thinking. Where does it come from? And for us as Christians, and for much of how our United States is in operating, we need to look at some of the foundational binaries in Christianity, that have been used to set up additional binaries in the ways that Christians operate within the rest of the world. So I want to start with the binary of the mind and body. You have a mind over here and you have a body, and how do we reckon with this, that there's some sort of dualistic or binary operation of those? So a lot of prominent Christian theologians have assumed this truth, this universal truth of a mind-body dualism, from Augustine to Luther to Calvin, and in some ways Thomas Aquinas. A lot of that comes from writings of Paul, who actually, though he talks a lot about mind and body, isn't doing it from a place of a binary. Sometimes Paul, in his letters, will subsume, will say a whole person is on the flesh side of the distinction, and other times on the spirit side of the distinction. So Paul uses flesh versus spirit as a lot of the way he talks about humans, but that actually that there's a way to read Paul that actually isn't a binary. And yet a lot of theologians have sort of taken that and run with it to think about this difference between the mind and body. And there was some influence in there from Greek philosophers as well. So it just kind of like, oh, it makes sense. Why not? Calvin, good old Calvin, our buddy from within the PCOSA. John Calvin, oh, I actually have a slide for him. He had this idea of dualism around creation and started to think about not just mind, body, but God and human. And so distinguish between God as transcendent and creation, that which God created, is the non-transcendent part, not as divine. And so it had this dichotomy, again, a diametric opposition of body and the soul and the spirit. So that again, flesh, body, embodiment starts to be the bad thing. Many of us have heard, sins of the flesh, or kind of all the ways that I think bodies get portrayed as what's bad. For those of us in the LGBT community, there's a lot of the love the sinner, hate the sin. And this, the sinner being their spirit or soul, and the sin that as gay people is, being in a relationship with same gender folks. I think that like perpetuates this mind-body dualism. And I think theologically, I want to make the point that seeing humanity and God as two distinct things, two distinct entities, is not the issue. But it's this idea of the diametric opposition that gets embedded in these distinctions. Diametric opposition gives power to one group over the other. And obviously God has more power than we as humans do, thanks be to God. But when we're thinking about it in these terms, what it can start to mean is you want to be the human closest to God. You want to be the person who has the most power relative to God. And I think that what I'll start to, the next binary I want to explore really took this idea of cleanliness as godliness, as, perfection as closest to God, and ran with it in terms of the power within. The next binary is around this idea of who is a Christian and who is a barbarian. And that takes us back to what we call the doctrine of discovery, which built on dualistic binaries of what or who is divine or closest to God and who is not, and applies that to create a divine mandate. And in so doing, enshrining Christians and Christianity as the supreme religion. And so the origin of the doctrine goes back to papal bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452, and then really took on a lot more water with Alexander the Sixth Pope, that allowed for seizing indigenous people. So this is on the left, we have Pope Alexander. On the right, we have an imprint of Columbus meeting, quote, the savages, right? I want to read a little bit from the papal bull Inter Cetera from Pope Alexander, May 4th, 1493. You might notice that's a year after Columbus, quote, sailed the ocean blue. So in this papal bull of the Doctrine of Discovery reads, among other works, well pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart, this assuredly ranks highest, that in our times especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to faith itself. You hear that? It's basically, yeah, we'll care for people because we are Christian, but we want their land. We want to take what we find, and they don't own the land because they're not Christian. So it's setting up that that dichotomy that you don't have a right to the land because you didn't divinely get it from God like we did. Doctrine of Discovery makes it to the United States in the 19th century when the US Supreme Court at the time ruled in the case Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823, stating that European nations had assumed dominion over the lands of America upon discovery, so Columbus and French and et cetera, and the Spanish. And as a result, Native Americans had lost their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations and retain a mere right of occupancy on their land. So they lost the ability to sell their property, to own it. And so it could be seized. They could live there as long as the government said they could, right? This is pretty rough. And the Doctrine of Discovery, thankfully, has been, repudiated all these years later by different faith groups, including the Presbyterian Church, as of 3-4 years ago, to say we don't buy into this anymore. We're pretty sorry. We want to examine what actually led us to even think this way in the first place. But I really name this because it starts to build on the idea of Christians as the supreme, like a binary of either you're Christian or you're not. And that starts to like pick up some steam as we move into colonizing additional lands. So I want to talk about, where did whiteness come from? The next binary, white or not. Now, in our current climate, we have lots of ways to talk about people who are not white as people of color, Black, Indigenous, people of color, for example. There's ways to nuance not being white, but for the sake of simple binaries and the way it operates around power, there's white and not white. So at first, from the doctrine of discovery, religious superiority was enough to justify stealing land and bodies, and then a distinction was needed to differentiate between the colonizers and the colonized, those who were stealing the land and those who had been living there, the enslavers and the enslaved. Once the quote barbarian was converted, a new categorization was needed. And so in the 1500s, so 1492, now in the 1500s, Europeans began to develop scientific racism. Now we call it that now. They were more like trying to find a, what they were trying to do was attempting to construct a biological rather than a cultural definition of race. Biological implies fixedness, it implies createdness from God. And so scientific racism could be the hot ticket to make sure we could enshrine power. And so scientific racism divided the world's population into a few large species, they called species, or groups. And the term for white people as Caucasians was first used as a synonym for Europeans in 1807, and was this attempt to draw a line between Europeans and Greco-Romans, like people from Greece and Rome, from the golden age of classical civilization. So Socrates, Plato, Roman Colosseums, all that good stuff. Now, what we know is that that line between white Europeans and people who lived in Greece and Rome in the era of the classics is a fantasy. It ignores the actual makeup of the people. Has anyone ever been to Greece or Rome or Italy? That were a mixture of Mediterranean, Jewish, and African populations. So there's a whole bunch of folks who are not light-skinned like this guy living in Greece and Rome in the era of classical Roman Greece. Okay, so they're trying to say, hey, we're related to Socrates and Plato because they were smart. They figured out dualism a long time ago. And so we can trace a direct line back to us. For anyone who, and you can see this in operation, if anyone's ever toured United States plantations in the South of folks who enslaved people, that they were built according to neoclassical architecture so that the slave master's mansion would look like the Parthenon of ancient Greece, suggesting a racial continuity of the enslavers. And an author that wrote a book on this, Dr. Gregory J., professor emeritus at University of Wisconsin, said, in the construction of whiteness, it was regularly said that slavery and democracy were not a contradiction, since the ancient Greeks had themselves been slave owners and regularly persecuted races considered, quote, barbarians. And I read that because you see in that one quote, the idea of Christian versus barbarian, intellectual elite versus uncivilized, white as fundamentally all of those things above and beyond people who are uncivilized. So whiteness starts to solidify as a dominant race, Christian, divinely ordained to be able to colonize others. Okay. So how does that come to America more specifically? This is a image of the melting pot, and a bunch of different nationalities are in here trying to vie for equal rights and getting stirred up. I want to quote from the first and most famous essay on this question of what is an American. It's from a French immigrant written in 1781 called Letters from an American Farmer. And the quote that is on the screen reads, "Whence came all these people to America? They are a mixture of Irish, French, Dutch, Germans, and Swedes. From this promiscuous breed, that race, now Americans, have arisen. What then is the American, this new man? He is neither a European nor the descendant of a European, hence that strange mixture of blood, which you will find in no other country. The Americans were once scattered all over Europe. Here they are incorporated into one of the finest systems of populations which has ever appeared." Now we notice in that quote, they're talking about specifically Western European countries. There's actually no Italians mentioned. There's no North, like there's a lot of countries left out and nationalities left out of this list. But what it's starting to do is solidify this idea of whiteness, specifically in America, a melting pot of identities that you have to shed your cultural backgrounds to become American. And what it means to be American is white. And I just, I don't have to go on and on about how that conception in some ways still exists and persists. And we've had to do a lot of work to undo a fundamental binary of American and not, citizen and not, and white and not. Oh, here's my example. I want to talk about kind of another binary and the ways in which the earlier binaries of dualistic thinking, Christians versus the world, landed and formed their unique melting pot in the United States to produce white Christian nationalism. So starting to take some binaries of us versus them and solidify them in a stack, like a deck of cards. And that it's been widely documented, including from Robert Jones's masterful work, White Too Long, the book that came out about a year ago, the ways in which white religious leaders and white churches played in creating a uniquely American and distinctly Christian form of white supremacy. So how does whiteness become not just a binary, but part of that power dynamic that churches legitimized slavery all over the place? And I in talking about the Greco-Roman references, we have Maidwood Plantation in Louisiana and First Presbyterian Church in Dallas, Texas. No shade to First Presbyterian Dallas. Not trying to disrespect them, but just looking at even the architecture of, like, we trace ourselves back to Greece and Rome as this kind of white project in the United States. So I want to reference here one of the leading theological apologists for slavery in his day, Reverend Dr. Basil Manley Sr., as a way of illustrating how binaries are getting linked now in this project of America. So in his writings, he believes slavery was not an unfortunate necessity, like some argued, but rather a divinely ordained hierarchical order of Christian society. So it's divinely ordained and it's based on a hierarchy. He based his argument for slavery on the gender binary, on this differentiation between men and women, on a patriarchal understanding of family. And he was the leading guy writing about theological justifications of slavery. And so his justification was based on the theological framework of the patriarchal family, which he saw as central to God's plan for human society. And he wrote that different members of the family have divinely ordained differentiated roles. Hey, we were just talking about that. And the practice of slavery should be understood within this historical context, right? So he's linking the relationship between enslaver and enslaved into this hierarchical understanding of family. So kind of crystallizing these binaries and norms in a big, it's like our snowball is getting bigger and bigger of this like avalanche of binaries that it is stacking up in a lot of ways to preserve who is in power. And so I want to kind of look at that stack for a minute, just to make sure we're clear, to see the ways in which binaries have found a home in white Christian nationalism. So we have the binary of Christian versus not, Christian being the most superior thing you could be. Then within the United States context, there's American, what it means to be an American and as a citizen of the United States who is granted voting rights, land, all kinds of things. And in our earliest formation of this country, it was white landowning men, presumably heterosexual, and cisgender people who identified as men from birth, not transgender people. And then somewhere in there, within this patriarchal understanding, is women, and there's all kinds of bad theology about families and women's relationship to men. And then you could draw a dotted line under this and look at other immigrant groups who eventually came to the United States, and which immigrant groups were given proximation, like closeness to whiteness, and see how power and privilege starts to play out within those groups. Eventually in our kind of framework after slavery is who gets to vote and how much blood do they have as a person who was formerly enslaved as a Black person in this country. So the lighter you are, the better off you might be in terms of access to power and privilege in this country, right? We've talked about this a lot in our work of justice. And I want to end with a quote in this moment from a quote from Frederick Douglass that I think articulately brings all the threads together. And he's talking in his book, The Life of a Slave, around I think, blasphemy he saw from religious leaders who purported to be religious and who were slave owners. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path to salvation. He who is the religious advocate of marriage robs whole millions of its sacred influence and leaves them to the ravages of wholesale pollution. The warm defender of the sacredness of the family relation is the same that scatters whole families, sundering husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers, leaving the hut vacant, the hearth desolate. The slave auctioneer's bell and the church-going bell chime in with each other, and the bitter cries of the heartbroken slave are drowned in the religious shouts of his pious master. That's a quote. And he names in there everything we were just talking about around binaries of kind of family life, ordering of society that are in operation, Christian and not, and the ways in which, to me, I think my ultimate learning that I want to share with you is that binaries are toxic because they have a poisoned root. They're not meant to be a side-by-side, just we're different, but it's a hierarchy that one is better, more godly, more perfect than the other. To me, and I know to you, that this is antithetical to our Christian theology. This is antithetical to our call from Jesus. This is not, to me, what it means to be a Christian, as Frederick Douglass so beautifully named. If we think about Galatians 3:28, there is neither slave, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female in Christ Jesus, that God breaks down binaries that separate people over and over again. And yet much of what Christianity has done is erect them back up again to try and preserve power, privilege, influence, capital, that we have to see this. To me, we can't repair it until we look at it. And tonight, I appreciate you journeying with me around, from back in time to of our own childhoods to doctrine of discovery, to looking at the ways in which we ourselves have been shaped and misshaped by binary operating thinking, and the ways in which our faith has done some of that misshaping. And so we end tonight on perhaps a note of discomfort. We might be a little bit still on the side of that horse, wondering how we're going to get back up again. But I firmly believe that God has a deeper call to us to see beyond binaries. And that is what we're going to explore tomorrow. But before we have a few more minutes to do some questions tonight. And before we come back tomorrow, I invite you to think about, in our own ministries and the work we do as Christians, where do binaries show up in our faith? We talked about it in our world a little bit ago, but where do we see examples of that in our mission and ministry in the world? And so we'll answer that tomorrow. And I'll nudge you again about it, so don't worry. But if you have time to think about it tonight, I think that's what I invite you to notice. But I will invite Pastor Edie to lead us in the next part of our conversation.
Well, you said that you were going to deconstruct a little bit tonight. The puzzle pieces are all over the floor, and tomorrow we will pick them up, start building a frame, looking for the right colors and the right pieces. And we put our trust in you, Alex, that you will help us put this all back together again. It was a wonderful big gulp of a lot of material tonight, but thank you so much. I wanted to close tonight with just a reminder that we start again tomorrow morning at 9:30. It's the same Zoom link that you used tonight. If you are also able to join us on Sunday morning, we use our Sunday morning link Zooms for our 9 o'clock ACE hour and the worship service at 10, but we'll give you more information about that this weekend. I think on this note, I'm going to go ahead and close us with the last few lines from Amanda's poem from Wednesday. Friends, we will rebuild, reconcile, and recover, and every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people diverse and beautiful will emerge. Battered and beautiful, when day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you all. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Alex.
Stay tuned.